Hello, my name is Andrew Cohen, and I'm a professor in the history department at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. This is a lecture on the history of the United States Constitution. The United States Federal Constitution represented a legal and political triumph. The Constitution of 1787 and the ensuing Bill of Rights of 1789 created the first national government committed to elected offices, limited jurisdictions, checks and balances, and defined liberties. At the same time, the new Constitution saved the Republic from serious instability following the Revolution, allowing for the creation of an enduring nation-state. Nevertheless, for many people, the Constitution represented a disappointing repudiation of the principles and promises of the Revolution. To win the war for independence, the founders had fomented people's rage at the inequalities of life in the British Empire. After the Revolution had ended, the founders no longer needed mobs to throw British tea in the harbor. Indeed, they came to believe that the Republic's survival depended upon an end to the kinds of mass protests they had once endorsed. The Revolution attacked authority but presumed the restoration of a legal order. The founders did not intend to allow the nation to slide into chaos, and as a consequence, they suppressed the types of protests they had once encouraged in 1776, and they pulled back from the more radical possibilities of the revolutionary period. Well, what were the promises of the revolutionary period? The founders had encouraged colonists to believe the revolution would result in broad equality. Agriculturalists working on land rented from favorites of the British Crown wanted to own their own farms. Sailors wanted to be free from the whippings and harsh discipline of the British Navy and Merchant Marine. Workers wanted an end to the legal prerogatives of their masters bestowed by common law. Enslaved blacks recognized that the egalitarian language of the Declaration of Independence applied to them as well. And some women hoped that the rebellion against the king might deliver them from the autocratic power of their husbands. The first Constitution of the United States was the Articles of Confederation, which defined the national government from 1777 to 1787. Under the Articles, the United States was more like a league of friendship. The federal government, under the Articles of Confederation, lacked a president or a judiciary. It had no diplomatic or war authority. And indeed, to pass a law required 2/3 of the states to approve. The federal government, under the Articles of Confederation, had a very limited tax power. Now, in this period, the period of the Revolution and afterwards, states began enacting a range of social reforms consistent with revolutionary values. For instance, many states liberalized manumission and even abolished the institution of slavery, recognizing that slavery was inconsistent with the values of the Declaration of Independence and the values being fought for in the Revolution. States abolished the imprisonment of people for debt. They abolished cruel and unusual punishment, ended feudal land laws, liberalized divorce, and even began creating public education systems. But freed from British laws, the United States had a booming but volatile society. And the chaotic conditions of the 1780s led to calls for a new form of national government. One of the problems was monetary. Once the war ended, the colonies ceased printing paper currency of the type you see on the screen. They were seeking to clamp down on rampant inflation caused by the printing of paper money. This caused a severe contraction of the money supply because there wasn't enough hard currency, that is to say, gold coins, to function as a medium of exchange. And people became so desperate that they began using foreign coins, guessing as to their value. State governments began producing their own coinage, but nevertheless, the United States government had a serious problem collecting taxes, which had to be paid in U.S. currency. The shortage of coins meant that many Americans were unable to pay their taxes, So thousands of Americans found themselves indicted for tax evasion simply for the lack of currency. The United States also had serious problems with taxes. During the war, the colonies had accrued massive debts in the forms of bonds owned by economic elites in the United States and abroad. Now, naturally, these investors had bet on the success of the war and the nation's survival, and they wanted to be paid back. But the various governments struggled to repay their debts, in part because farmers were unable to pay their taxes. Farmers were usually in debt anyway, as they borrowed in the winter for food, clothing, seed, and feed, and repaid their creditors in the fall after harvest. Now, state governments attempted to address the crisis of taxation and debt, but their actions actually created new problems. Faced with financial disaster, farmers elected state legislators who passed debt relief legislation. And these laws infuriated creditors and made them unwilling to lend money. The crisis became so severe that citizens staged an armed rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786. Daniel Shays, who you see on the left, was a farmer and former Revolutionary Army captain frustrated by taxes, the shortage of money, and the legal system. Farmers like Shays had no specie, that is to say hard currency, so they could not pay their taxes, resulting in their incarceration for debt. In Western Massachusetts, they held a convention, drafted grievances, demanded paper currency, lower taxes, and judicial reform. When the federal government ignored their demands, 2,500 men took up arms, with Shays and Job Shattuck at the lead. The governor of Massachusetts, James Bowdoin, and others who had vigorously opposed British taxation in 1776 labeled Shays and Shattuck and the other farmers treasonous rebels. And the federal government sent 4,000 Continental soldiers to quell Shays Rebellion, many of the men being captured and others fleeing. Though many enslavers had favored a loose confederation of states to ensure no central government would free their captives, they soon found reason for frustration with the Articles of Confederation. When Pennsylvania and Ohio abolished slavery between 1780 and 1787, it created an incentive for enslaved blacks in Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky to flee northward across the porous borders that separated them from freedom. Enslavers immediately recognized that the Articles of Confederation offered them no way of retrieving those who refused to toil without consent, contract, or compensation. At the same time, the United States faced significant challenges in foreign affairs. In 1784, pirates off the coast of North Africa seized U.S. merchant ships. In the past, those ships would have been defended by the British Navy, but Americans no longer had the British Navy or any navy to defend them. The colonial navy had been disbanded after 1783. As a result, under the Articles, there was no one to defend American shipping. Moreover, the United States was surrounded by colonies belonging to England, France, and Spain. And many Americans feared that new states would be picked off one by one. Finally, white settlers who migrated into the Ohio River Valley in violation of treaties with indigenous tribes complained that there was no army present to protect them from furious native people. And all of these factors caused many Americans to demand an army and a navy to protect American citizens against people from other countries and indigenous people. Taken together, these conditions all led the founders to fear the republic might soon fall apart. So some well-meaning men, specifically Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, began writing a series of articles both calling for a new constitution and outlining the framework for a stronger central government. These are known, of course, as the Federalist Papers. After that, the United States Congress sponsored a secret meeting, and when the framers were finished, they had completely redesigned the American nation state. They had rejected localism in favor of centralized government. Now they justified the semi-illegal usurpation of power by insisting that the crisis demanded it. The people could not act, so respectable citizens needed to step forward and take charge of the situation. There were initially some strong opponents of this proposal. Fear of centralized authority had been one issue inspiring the American Revolution. Many critics believed that the state and local government was inherently more democratic and responsive than a central government. They were also concerned that wealthy elites, such as merchants and bankers, would control the new government. And they feared both the cost and the power of a standing army. These opponents of a new constitution were further frustrated by the document created by Hamilton, Madison, and other founders in 1787, for it lacked a clear Bill of Rights. Nevertheless, the new constitution went to the states for ratification, and though the ratification elections were not democratic by our lights, 85% of the population could not vote, including women, children, blacks, and poorer white men, the process was arguably the most open in the history of the world up to that time. The Constitution redefined the power of the states and the federal government. It sought to address what it saw as the excesses of the old system. The main limit on the states was imposed by what is called the Contracts Clause. This clause barred states from enacting ex post facto laws, that is, criminal statutes that made past conduct illegal retroactively. The clause also banned statutes interfering with private contracts, in particular laws that forgave existing debt agreements. The Constitution also prohibited states from imposing barriers to trade within the Union. So, for instance, New Jersey could not tax goods imported from New York State. And finally, this clause banned states from waging war, reserving that power to the federal government. The new Constitution also created federal jurisdiction. Section 8 of the Constitution gave to the federal government the power to regulate interstate commerce. This would be a much debated clause in the future of American constitutional history. It gave control of financial issues to the federal government, such as the coinage of new currency, and it gave to the federal government the power to wage war. But the Constitution also placed limits on the power of the United States federal government. Section 9 of the Constitution prohibited Congress from interfering with the international slave trade for 20 years. It also guaranteed to citizens the writ of habeas corpus. This meant that the government could not hold individuals in perpetuity without telling them what crimes they were accused of committing. And again, it barred ex post facto laws. Within 2 years, the demands of anti-federalists for a Bill of Rights were satisfied. The provisions of the Bill of Rights, remarkable, comprehensive, creating a whole set of categories of freedoms to be protected against the intrusion of the government. The right to free speech, the right to freedom of religion, the right to self-defense, the right to property. The Bill of Rights also created a set of rights for the criminally accused, and indeed much of the Bill of Rights was dedicated to the rights of those accused of crimes, defendants and convicts. But it is important to remember that as remarkable as the Bill of Rights was, as expansive as it was, as new as it was in limiting the government's power to intrude in whole areas of human experience, it was only at the federal level in this period. That is, the Bill of Rights only restricted the federal government from interfering with people's speech. It only restricted the federal government from interfering with people's religion. It only restricted the federal government from interfering with self-defense and the right to property. But if the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were remarkable documents which helped secure the Republic amidst the insecurity of the 1880s and created a new government, one much more responsive to the people than any other in human history, nevertheless, these documents pulled back from the radicalism of the American Revolution. For instance, consider the condition of enslaved people. In return for supporting the new Constitution, Southern states demanded protection for their so-called right to own human beings as property. Now, it is important to recognize that the Constitution never specifically uses the word slavery, but it averred to the institution in 3 separate clauses. In the 3/5 clause, the Constitution apportioned all states' congressmen in proportion to the white population plus 60% of the African American population. This had the effect of giving Southern states extra congressmen that they did not deserve because they were giving them congressmen to represent enslaved people who could not vote, indeed, who could not even move or work on their own account. The second piece was the Fugitive Slave Clause, which promised that the federal government would retrieve individuals who escaped from slavery. Congress soon gave force to that clause. In 1791, an African-American man named John Davis escaped from slavery in Virginia to freedom in Pennsylvania. Southerners came north to Pennsylvania and kidnapped Davis, taking him back to the man who claimed to own him. Pennsylvania indicted the Virginians and sought their extradition. Virginia's governor refused that request, arguing that Davis was a quote-unquote fugitive slave, subject to rendition. In response to this crisis, Congress drafted the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law, making it a federal crime to assist an escaping enslaved person. Finally, the Constitution forbade Congress from banning the international slave trade for 20 years. To understand this clause, you need to recognize that the international slave trade was viewed, even in this period, as a crime against humanity. Many Americans, even those who owned human beings, such as Thomas Jefferson, viewed the international slave trade as grotesque and inhumane. This provision prohibited Congress from doing anything about an institution that they knew to be immoral. You see in this image a picture of an early example of fugitive slaves being accosted, kidnapped, and returned to slavery. It is important to also recognize that many poorer Americans, farmers, and workers viewed the Revolution as disappointing. We today don't think of the relationship between employers and workers as subject to criminal law. But in this period, the common law forced sheriffs, constables, and prosecutors to enforce labor agreements. Criminal justice officials caught and jailed enslaved people who ran away, and their masters could retrieve them, but this was also true for white servants. Masters not only had liberty to physically punish their employees, they could have them jailed for refractory or disobedient behavior. Jails often held servants who ran away or defied the terms of their indenture. Many of these working people, these servants, might have looked at the Revolution and hoped that it would do something to better their condition, to try and remove the criminal restrictions that bound them to their employers. Sailors who missed their ships or defied their captains could be punished with whippings or held in jail. Sailors had been critical to the Revolutionary War effort, and many of these tars may have felt that the Revolution should have protected them. Instead, we see the Constitution leaving these relationships intact. From the moment the Revolution began, many women realized the implications of the war's egalitarianism and its attack on patriarchal authority. After the war was won, Abigail Adams, the wife of future President John Adams, wrote, quote, "I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands, unquote. John Adams replied, joking that men, quote, know better than to repeal our masculine systems, unquote. The possibility for much greater equality was demonstrated by New Jersey, where the state constitution of 1776 allowed women with property to vote. And this principle was reaffirmed in New Jersey by an electoral law in 1790. And women continued to vote, comprising as much as 25% of the electorate until 1807, when the legislature took suffrage away from women with property. This period demonstrates that far from being an outlandish fantasy, the idea of women's equality was actually understood to be one possible implication of the Revolution, denied by the U.S. Constitution and succeeding legislation. If the Constitution represented a reining in of the revolutionary principles, then the federal government embodied this retrenchment. Not long after the ratification of the Constitution and the enactment of the Bill of Rights, Europe was rocked by the French Revolution. From its inception, the French Revolution was much more violent and radical than its American counterpart. Restrictions on religion and the abolition of slavery were implemented by the French during their revolution. And by 1793, this upheaval had become the Reign of Terror, featuring mass executions of as many as 40,000 people. At the same time, revolutionary France became actively militaristic, fighting wars with Austria and Holland. The founders sought to avoid this fate by clamping down on Americans who sought to challenge the new American constitutional order. And the new tax system created by the Constitution provided them with an opportunity to demonstrate the power of the new federal government. Congress enacted a 25% excise tax on whiskey to pay off war debts. Whiskey was a major source of revenue for farmers because it was easy to transport. The United States had very poor roads in this period, so many farmers preferred to turn their wheat into whiskey as a way of making it easier to transport to market. Well, the initial reaction to the imposition of the new excise tax in Western Pennsylvania was mild. Petitions, some tax evasion. Between 1791 and 1793, some farmers intimidated a handful of excisemen. The Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, one of the framers of the Constitution, began increasing the pressure, and on May 30th, the Treasury summoned 75 distillers to Philadelphia on charges of tax evasion. Now, it is important to understand that Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, where most of these farmers were getting angry, are very far apart. Even today, they're 7 hours by car. Back then, that was a journey that took over a day. So this meant that farmers were going to have to leave their farms for over a day and stay in hotels or pubs in Philadelphia at great cost to themselves. On July 15, 1794, 40 men attacked the U.S. Marshal and Excise Inspector in Western Pennsylvania, but nobody was hurt. And the next day, 100 men unsuccessfully attacked the inspector's house. And on the third day, 500 rebels returned and burned his mansion to the ground. 2 weeks later, they marched through Pittsburgh and peacefully dispersed. But the president, George Washington, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, marched in anyway, sending the army in, a show of force. The purpose here for Washington was to demonstrate federal power and to tell the American people that the revolution was over. Historians often describe the American War for Independence as a quote-unquote conservative revolution. But this confuses the results with the intentions. Many who fought in the Revolutionary War wanted a more expansive definition of freedom, one that included emancipation, workers' rights, and even women's liberation. But leaders were more ambivalent. They wanted to guide popular rebellious impulses toward their own ends and used law and legal language to establish the legitimacy of protest and revolt. But once the war was over, their ambivalence became, somewhat reactionary. They believed that their experiment depended upon crushing mass protest and believed that dissent had to occur in lawful channels, namely electoral politics. If we look at the Constitution overall, we can argue that the Constitution saved the Republican experiment that was created by the Revolutionary War of 1776. The United States was sliding into non-existence, or perhaps to become a colony of the British Empire again. The Constitution prevented that from happening. But at the same time, the Constitution turned its back on many of the revolutionary values and revolutionary possibilities, and thus represented a disappointment to many Americans. It would take over a century for some of those reversals to turn back toward justice.